Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Rob, for organizing this series. Thank you, Mr. Berry, for sponsoring the series. I also want to thank everybody for showing up here tonight to talk about love and skepticism. And I want to thank also the previous speakers in this series, and I hope there will be connections between what I'm going to talk about tonight and the previous talks. I believe there are direct and clear connections with the very last talk in the series 2 weeks ago, which is not surprising given that David was talking about Kierkegaard, and I'm talking about Wittgenstein. And of course, Wittgenstein was an admirer of Kierkegaard, and Kierkegaard was, in fact, one of the few philosophers that he actually respected and acknowledged having a depth to. And actually, you can see, and this was part of David's talk, that there is a clear thematic connection, a clear convergence of philosophical passions between Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein. Some of the central topics that they were obsessed about, such as anxiety, despair, love, truth, subjectivity, are there. And even though Wittgenstein is a very different kind of philosopher in some respects, and he's focusing on philosophy of language, and he's getting at issues from the perspective of communication, miscommunication, meaning, nonsense, there are actually also methodological affinities. And I hope that in some of the things that I'm going to say, you will see even some very strong and interesting existential component in Wittgenstein's philosophy, and also a phenomenological component as well. The topic that I'm going to be focusing on, love and skepticism, is also related to some of the reflections that David offered a couple of weeks ago, because the central topic, as I'm going to develop it in today's lecture, is how can we be cognitively and affectively connected to other people. So I want to make this very clear from the beginning, and I'll talk more about it later. The kind of skepticism that he develops in this respect is interestingly different from the standard and traditional skepticism about other minds that you typically find in the literature. It's not only a skepticism about whether or not there are other minds, or a skepticism about what kind of cognitive access we have to other minds and their experiences. That's part of it, but it's not just that. It is what I'm going to describe as a skepticism about intersubjectivity. Or another way to put it is a skepticism about intimacy and the possibility of sharing experiences, the possibility of sharing pains and pleasures, the possibility of having a social bond of some kind. And there is a cognitive dimension to that I'm going to get into, but there is also a very important affective dimension to that. So it's not only do we have cognitive access to other minds and their contents, it is also do we have an affective connection with other minds and what they are going through. And also, something that is very distinctive about this kind of skepticism, that's why I'm trying to highlight it from the beginning, is that it is the kind of skepticism that is simultaneously about our relationship with other people and also about our relationship with ourselves. And you cannot separate those two dimensions, as I will try to show a little later. And that's not true of a lot of versions of skepticism about other minds, because the standard version, it is about other minds, not about my mind. It is about them. But this one is about my relationship with shared experiences. So I'll get into that little by little. Before I get into love, I want to give you just some few preliminary remarks about Wittgenstein's conception of philosophy, what philosophy is, and his philosophical method, just to give you a sense of where he's coming from, where his philosophical commitments are, and what kind of approach he's using to get into the issue of love and the issue of skepticism. So everybody should have a handout. I hope there were enough copies for everybody, and it is two-sided. So on the front side of the handout, I want to highlight in section 1, which is about Wittgenstein's conception of philosophy, his meta-philosophy, and his methodology, two things that are crucial. The first thing that is crucial is for him, philosophy is not at all a body of doctrine. It is a practice. And the kind of practice that it is conversation. And it can be a conversation that you have with yourself, if you're philosophizing by yourself, if you're having this meditation, or it can be a conversation that you have with other people. And even though he was a solitary guy, he strongly recommended doing it with other people. Because if you do it by yourself, then it becomes more dangerous, and it becomes a path to madness that is very hard to avoid for him. So it is a practice. It is a conversational practice, a critical practice. It is not about answering problems. It is not about finding solutions. It is not about developing theories or systems of thoughts that are going to solve practical problems. It is about learning how to live with those problems. And he thinks that every reflective, critical person will stumble upon philosophical problems, will come to philosophical problems at some point in her life. And he thinks it is important to figure out how to live with these problems. And it is a mistake to think that the thing to do is to solve the problem once and for all, to come with a solution that you can give to yourself or to other people, to come up with a system of thought. He thinks that it is a practice that will never end. It is a continued practice. He also describes the practice as a therapeutic practice. And the reason for that is because we're trying to cure ourselves of obsessions, dangerous illusions, dangerous idealizations. And we have to figure out what those obsessions are and what they mean for us, what they mean to our lives. Then the second thing that I want to emphasize about his view of philosophy is that one of his most important philosophical commitments is that philosophical practice should be continuous with ordinary practice, the continuity between philosophy and ordinary life. And part of what that means is that our philosophical reflections, our philosophical conversations, our practices as philosophers or philosophical thinkers should be answerable to real life and real problems and real people and their experiences. And that's part of what he means by friction. Our philosophical thinking should encounter friction, the friction that results from the rough ground of our ordinary life. And that's the first quote that you have in the handout. So he says, "We got on to a slippery ice where there is no friction, and so in a certain sense the conditions are ideal. But also just because of that, we are unable to walk. We want to walk, so we need friction, back to the rough ground." So he's criticizing idealizations. He's criticizing one way of doing philosophy and one kind of philosophical theory building that will remain at a purely ideal level. Now notice, in my reading anyway, it's not that he's saying there is something wrong with the idealization always, so that we shouldn't use them in philosophy, or that we should never leave the rough ground. What he's saying is we have to come back to the rough ground. So you can leave the rough ground, you can idealize all you want, and he himself uses the philosophical imagination and thought experiments all the time, but you have to connect those idealizations with the real life of real people and figure out what that means for you. There are two ways in which he criticizes philosophical illusions, philosophical obsessions, and philosophical idealizations. He says, that's one way, they become irrelevant for our lives. They become idle. They are, that's the metaphor that he uses, like the idle wheels of a mechanism that run and go around without nothing turning with them. They don't make any difference. If that is the kind of philosophizing that you're doing about love, for example, or about your emotional life in general, or about the meaning of life, that is not the way to go. You're running in circles. It's not making any difference in your life. So that's one complaint. Another complaint is that also, if it is something that is not going to enable you to see your life differently, because you don't connect it with your own life, it may be distorting your life. It may be distorting how you look at things. And that also is a problem. Either it is irrelevant or it becomes distorting because you have expectations that don't fit any actual practice. Okay, so going now to his methodology, he was committed to start philosophy and also to end in his philosophical reflections with what people actually do and what people actually say. So actual actions, actual expressions, And for any topic in philosophy, including the emotions and our affective life, he wanted to find out what is the physiognomy of that, as he called it. What is the appearance that takes in our actual lives? What are the patterns of actual actions and actual expressions that you can find associated with that? And that is what you have in the next two quotes, a way of showing the questions that you need to ask when you start philosophizing about the affects. So he says, how do we compare the behavior of anger, joy, hope, expectation, belief, love, and understanding? Act like an angry person. That's easy. Like a joyful one. Here it would depend on what the joy was about. The joy of seeing someone again, or the joy of listening to a piece of music. Hope? That would be hard. Why? There are no gestures of hope. How does hoping that one will return express itself? Now, this remark about gestures is very important, because the first thing that he wants to start with in his philosophizing is embodied communicative acts. And that is what he means by gestures. What are the physiognomy of this phenomenon that we call love? What is the physiognomy of this phenomenon that we call hope? And he says, well, look at gestures of love. Look at gestures of hope. Now, he thinks, and this is what he's saying about hope, well, sometimes you don't find gestures. And that's a problem, because there is a more indirect connection between the phenomenon and what people actually say to each other and what people actually do. In the case of love, however, we are in luck, because there are gestures of love. And that's the next quote. He says, just think of the words exchanged by lovers. They are loaded with feeling. And surely you can't just agree to substitute for them any other sounds you please, as you can with technical terms. Isn't this because they are gestures? And that is what he is saying. Well, they seem to be gestures. What kind of gestures are they? That's the beginning of his philosophy of love. What kind of gestures are they? And what kind of normativity do they have? What norms do they involve when we examine these gestures of love? In some cases, they could be empty gestures, so that they look like gestures of love, but there is nothing there. In other cases, we could say there is real love there. And what makes the difference? So that's what we're going to try to get into. So the next section, the next set of remarks are about love. Now, the first thing that is important to say here is that you shouldn't expect to find a theory of love in Wittgenstein. He's not going to give you that. You shouldn't expect to find a theory of anything in Wittgenstein. And one of the reasons is the following. He wants to emphasize that with love, as with many other human phenomena, you have a very complex, diverse, heterogeneous phenomenon. And it is philosophically dangerous to expect from the beginning that you are going to be able to find a definition that covers all the cases, that you are going to be able to give a theoretical unification to such a vast, diverse, heterogeneous array of cases. So his attitude is, don't expect that. And in fact, when you start looking at actual cases of love and how people talk about love and how people express love and the patterns of actions that go with the phenomenon of love, the first thing that you're going to find, and that's 2A in the handout, although it's not a quote, is many different names for love. He emphasizes that again and again. And also, many different types of love. And he talks about paternal love, maternal love, filial love, romantic love, platonic love. Also, he talks about the love of life, the love of the country, all kinds of phenomena. And they have similarities, overlapping and crisscrossing. And there are interesting things that you can say about clusters of them. And he's not against generalizing. Generalizations are fine, but you have to be very careful how you qualify your generalizations. And that's the first thing. Don't expect a definition of love. Don't think that you're going to find the essence of love, the set of necessary and sufficient conditions for what counts as love. He's not going to give you that, and he doesn't think that is to be found. However, he does think that there are some general features that a lot of different types of love have. Some grammatical remarks, he says, that can be given about love. And by that he means some very interesting and very general normative expectations that we have about love and what that means. Now, the most famous quote from Wittgenstein about love, that many of you, maybe all of you, have already encountered at some point somewhere, is in 2b. And 2b says, love is not a feeling. That's the famous quote, right? Love is put to the test. Pain is not. One does not say, that was not true pain, or it would not have gone off so quickly, right? So let me just spend a minute on this, what this means. Love is not a feeling. Now notice that he's saying love is not a feeling, but he's going to go on in these pages to show how love is intimately related to our feelings. So it's not a feeling itself, but it is dependent upon our feelings. This is what he distinguishes in these sections of Settle, the book called Settle. He distinguishes 3 different levels of our affective life. The level of sensations or feelings, such as pain, pleasure, the level of emotions or moods, such as anger or indignation or infatuation, and then the level of disposition, okay? He wants to say that there are some very complex affective structures, such as love, but also hope, despair, hate, that are not feelings or sensations, and they are not mere moods or emotions, emotional states. Why not? Because they don't have the kind of immediacy that sensations have. It's not something that you feel in an instant. It's not something that is absolutely immediate. It is extended over time. It involves a pattern. Okay? It is, however, related to what you feel and your sensations, and it is also related to the moods that you go through and your emotional states, but it's a different level of abstraction that your affective life is operating at, and it is a complex affective structure that will organize and let you interpret and let you revisit your sensations and feelings and emotions. So the way to think about it is in these 3 layers: sensations or feelings, moods or emotions, and dispositions, is that there is traffic going in every direction. And there is, in fact, a feedback loop, so that the feelings and sensations that you have around one person and the emotional states and the moods that you have when you are with that person will feed into the affective structure, the affective pattern that you develop with respect to that person, right? And once you have reached that pattern of love or hate or whatever it is, in turn, there will be traffic going in the other direction, so that your love will organize your sensations and your emotions, and you will revisit them, and you will give them a space to those sensations and emotions in your life, given that you love that person or you hate that person or whatever it is. So that's very important. That actually explains some of the other quotes that I have here. Precisely because love is an temporally extended pattern, it's not something that you can feel in an instant. It's not something that you have an immediate relationship with, and therefore you can be uncertain as to whether or not you are in love. Even if you have some degree of certainty, it's something that you have to prove to others and to yourself, something that has to be put to the test. Now, you may wonder, well, you said it's a temporally extended pattern. What kind of pattern are we talking about? And he hesitates when he describes in more detail the kind of affective structure that love is and the kind of affective pattern that it involves. And I think, all this is just my own hypothesis, that in part it is because he wants to distinguish between being in love and being in a loving relationship. So sometimes he describes it as a pattern of attitudes and commitments. And that suggests a very subjective kind of pattern. It has to do with my attitudes, and it has to do with my commitments. And I think that's what he means by being in love. Sometimes, however, he talks about an interactive pattern. It's not just about your attitudes and your commitments. It's about how you act and interact. And it is a pattern of actions and expressions. But I think that goes more with being in a loving relationship. Not just being in love, but being in a loving relationship. And that typically involves not only things that you are committed to doing, but things that are possible to do because of the other person, and things that in some cases will involve reciprocity. Not only what you do, but what the other person is willing to do with you. Now, let's just go to the next quote in which he says, could someone have a feeling of ardent love or hope for the space of 1 second, no matter what preceded or followed this second? What is happening now has significance in these surroundings. The surroundings give it its importance. And the word hope, and we could say the same thing about love, or the word love, refers to a phenomenon of human life. A smiling mouth smiles only in a human face. So this is part of his contextualism. The pattern in question, in this case an affective pattern, a pattern of attitudes and commitments, a pattern of actions and expressions, it is a pattern that only makes sense in a context, in a particular practice. So you need a practice to go along with the pattern that you're trying to express and enact and be part of. So love is not up to you. It is up to this communal, sustained practice of loving. It is something that requires a form of life. It is a human experience that involves a form of life, a community, and a set of expressions that make sense in that context, when things are understood in that way, when things are lived in that way. And I'll come back to that. So he says, and that is important because this connects with the next quote and with the next remark, the next thought, which is, we are also wrong when we think about love as something purely subjective and something that is inside, something that belongs to the individual, something that we can introspect. That is part of love. It has a subjective dimension, but that's not all that love is. So in the next quote he says, does it make sense to ask, how do you know that you believe? And is the answer, I know it by introspection. I know my beliefs because I can introspect that I know what I believe. In some cases, it will be possible to say some such thing. In most cases, not. It makes sense to ask, do I really love her? Or am I only pretending to myself? And the process of introspection is the calling up of memories, of imagined possible situations, and of the feelings that one would have if so and so were to happen. So notice that he's going to feelings now. When you're calling to question your love for somebody, introspection may be part of it. You may say, wait a minute, am I really in love? And you can introspect. You can say, I'm going to look inside myself. I'm going to entertain everything that may be relevant in my emotional life to answer that question. And you revisit experiences. You start examining memories. You critically question your feelings to find out how to interpret those feelings, what they mean. But that's only part of what you do. That's what he's emphasizing. That is only part of what you do. It's not only that kind of introspective cognitive access that will settle the issue. There is more than that. To begin with, it has to do with not only what you say to yourself or to others and what you feel, but what your actions really are and the pattern of actions that people can detect. And it has to do also with what other people say to you and how they react to you. And that is something that is not purely introspective, that you don't have any special authority on, that can be contested, and it is something that can be called into question. Now, what is the point of questioning your affective life? What is the point of questioning whether or not you are in love? What is the point of this critical examination? What is the space for skepticism in our emotional life? Now, let me say a couple of things about that. The skepticism about intersubjectivity, the skepticism about intimacy that I want to focus on. The first thing I said earlier, I hope I'll have just a few minutes to say a little bit more about. It is a mistake to think that the skepticism about intimacy is only an epistemic issue and it's only a cognitive issue, that it has to do with our cognitive access to other minds. That's part of it, but notice, even if we were to settle those traditional skeptical questions, even if we were to say, we're going to assume that, yes, there are other minds, and we're going to assume that we have some kind of reliable access to the contents of those minds, to their experiences. even if we were to assume all of that, there is yet another layer of a skeptical doubting, which is the one that he's interested in, which is, well, you still don't know what that means. You still don't know what meaningful relationship you have with those minds, what it means for that other person to be in pain or to be experiencing pleasure. You still don't know the significance of that. It is, if you want to put it in that way, a skepticism about meaning. Yes, let's grant the existence of other mind. Yes, let's grant that we have some reliable access to their contents. Still, do we share anything? Do we share the significance of these mental episodes? What do they mean for them? And then what do they mean for me? This kind of a skeptical layer of reflection applies equally to others and to oneself. If it is not enough to settle that the other person is in pain because I still don't know what that means, that applies to me as well. I may have some kind of immediacy with my feelings. I know this hurts, or I know this feels great. But still, what does that mean, really? What does that mean for me? Right? Now, let me, even though I have been emphasizing this analogy, a contrast between Wittgenstein's skepticism about intimacy and traditional forms of skepticism, let me now actually draw an analogy or connect more traditional forms of skepticism to explain more vividly this skepticism about intimacy. In the same way that traditional skeptical reflections have used ideal scenarios or best case scenarios, so that Descartes would say, one way in which you can make your doubts, your skeptical doubts radical, is by going to the best possible case, to optimal conditions. Even when you can trust that everything is going well, even in that case, like the surrounding conditions are good, my sensory organs are working well, can I still doubt whether or not this is a hand that I'm looking at? Even in that case, if you can still doubt, that's the most radical form of doubt that you can reach, because then that means, well, you can always doubt then. The same kind of methodology can be used here for calling into question whether or not we can share experiences, whether or not we can have intimacy. What would be the best case scenario? What would be the best imaginable situation in which there you have some kind of certainty? There you cannot doubt anymore. And one likely candidate is, well, the most intimate kind of relationship you can think of. For example, sharing pains and pleasures with your partner, if you're thinking about romantic love. Are there cases in which I cannot doubt that we are sharing a pain or a pleasure? Are there cases in which the pain of the other person is unequivocal? Of course she's in pain, and I know how to react to that. I know how to comfort her or him. I know. Or are there cases of sharing a pleasure that I cannot call into question? Well, of course that is enjoyment. Of course, we are sharing this pleasure. So imagine two lovers actually sharing some pleasures and having an enjoyment that they think is an enjoyment that they have in common. Are there cases in which, even if everything goes well, you could still call it into question? And he's saying, Wittgenstein is suggesting, yes, at the level of meaning, at the level of whether or not we are in sync emotionally, because things mean the same thing for us, you can always call that into question, even in the best case scenario. So sharing a dessert and having this shared culinary enjoyment, or having sex and sharing this sexual pleasure together, even if you think, well, I'm not just certain about what is going on with me, I'm also certain about what is going on with him. The moaning, the rolling of the eyes, well, of course, he's enjoying that. But then, of course, even setting aside cases of deception, even if you say, no, I'm not being deceived, he's honest, he's sincere, well, what does the moaning and the rolling of the eyes really mean? Right? He could be thinking, is that all you've got? Or, but notice, and this is the most interesting thing, it applies equally to you. Even if you say, wait, I could deceive myself, but if I'm honest, and if I'm feeling this, and if I know and I'm enjoying this, and I'm moaning and rolling my eyes and so on when I'm having the chocolate mousse or whatever it is, or something else for that matter. Well, actually, in the same way that you can say about the other person, maybe, you are only pretending to yourself, or maybe you think that that's the best you can reach when it comes to a culinary pleasure or a sexual pleasure. And then later on, you can realize that you were confused, so that it wasn't so clear, that maybe you were saying to yourself, is that all you've got, right? Now, I'm running out of time already, and I was planning to say much more. So I'm going to skip over a lot of what I wanted to say just to go to two crucial things. One thing that he's saying is that once you start calling into question the most basic bond between you and other people, when you start living in suspicion, that is the path of distraction, and there is no way back. And there is a form of madness involved there that makes your affective life impossible, and there is no way out, because you are never going to have certainty, right? You cannot have complete certainty about higher order affective structures, because they are not immediate, they are extended over time, they are always open into the future. You will never have secure epistemic foundations on which to build these affective bonds. It is not that you can find certainty of some kind and find some epistemic foundations and then build trust on those foundations and then say, now I love you, now you are my friend, or now you are my lover, or it doesn't work that way. You will never start a friendship. You will never start or continue a loving relationship if that is what you're looking for. It works, in fact, the other way around. It's not because I have achieved complete certainty about our relationship and my trust in you that now I can trust you and now you can be my friend. It is the other way around. It is because I have decided, or in some cases it's not a decision, I have found myself in this relationship with you, having you as my father or as my mother, having you as a friend, or having you. It is because of that I have certain commitments. And I commit myself to trusting you. I commit myself to having a particular kind of affective and cognitive relationship with you. And I was going to show, but it didn't work, one clip from Orson Welles' Othello that has all kinds of interesting things. And one of the interesting things that it has is that you can see how in conversation with Iago, as soon as the doubt that Iago is trying to put in Othello's mind is there, and he starts accepting the doubt, there is no way out. The path to destruction and the path to madness is right there, and it is inescapable. And one thing that is really interesting, that's why I wanted to show that clip, is that in Orson Welles' adaptation of this, it is very clear that it's not just about doubting Desdemona. It is about doubting himself. And he's listening to Iago in this version, looking at himself in a mirror. And you can see how the maddening reflections that he is entertaining affect not only his relationship with Desdemona, but also his relationships with himself. He no longer trusts his own feelings. He no longer trusts his interpretations about what he feels. He no longer trusts himself. And he cannot trust Desdemona either. Another interesting thing about that clip and that entire dynamics there is that you can see how the support of the community, the support of practices around you that enable you to make sense of your love are crucially important. And in this case, we're dealing with a love that is transgressive, a love that at the time was not accepted, interracial love. And we're seeing how everything that Iago is saying and everything that Othello is responding to has a lot to do with making it unintelligible for a black man to love a white woman, and more importantly, in that clip I was going to show, for a white woman to love a black man. And the interesting thing about the clip also, it's like I'm reenacting the clip here, is that he says the same thing, and you can see how the doubting the madness is settling in, even though the content of what he says doesn't change. He says, I cannot think but that Desdemona is honest. And then you see the conviction and you see the trust. But then not minutes, just seconds later, he says, I cannot think but that Desdemona is honest. And you can see not only the hesitation, but more importantly, the embarrassment. He looks at himself in the mirror, and he feels almost embarrassed to have thought that he could be loved by her. And there is this really interesting dynamic. Okay, there's much more to say. Let me just go to the questions I have here so that we can just open it for discussion. I have 3 questions to offer, but of course there are many other questions that you may have, and we don't need necessarily to focus the discussion on this question. One interesting question is, well, is Wittgenstein a skeptic? Given that he doesn't think that this search for secure foundations, for absolutely reliable trust is to be found, does that mean that he's a skeptic? And one interesting thing to say here is that he seems to be very hesitant to answer the question whether or not the skepticism is correct. He's critical about the skeptics, of course, but he's also critical about anti-skeptics. So one thing to think about, one suggestion is to say that maybe he would reject the question whether or not the skepticism is correct, because he doesn't want to say that the skepticism is wrong, that there is an answer to the skeptic, that there is a solution to the skeptic, but at the same time, he's clearly not comfortable with the skepticism. So he doesn't have a solution to skeptical paradoxes and skeptical problems, that's for sure. Is he a skeptic? Well, maybe he's not solving the skeptical problem, but maybe he's dissolving the skeptical problem, trying to look at it in such a way that there is a way of recovering from that madness. There is a way of living your life, even though you realize that you're never going to have some certainties and some epistemic foundations as solid pillars of your life. Now, second question. Well, is intimacy possible for him? Is intersubjectivity and community possible? Or is it always an illusion? Something that we may or may not believe in, but it's never real because it's never fully realized. Well, that's an open question too. One thing that he seems to be trying to do is to give an account of this that is not essentially cognitive or purely cognitive, and to shift the ground from the cognitive to the affective, and to talk about things such as intercorporeality, how our bodies together react to each other and share certain things, as being the foundation. So, for example, as many of you know, one of the famous discussions of pain, reacting to pain, sharing pain, about whether or not animals can feel pain, he says, we may have all the doubts in the world, but you look at an animal in pain, an animal dying, even a fly, the wriggling fly trying to escape from the bottle in which it's trapped, and you have an immediate embodied reaction to that. And that's very important. And then third question, or set of questions. If affective structures such as love require community support, a form of life, a shared form of life, is it possible to love in bad company or without company? Is it possible to love when you don't have any support, when people don't understand your love, when there is no language available for you to express your love? And of course, cases such as interracial love or homosexual love are cases in which you couldn't love in good company. You have the entire community, the entire society telling you that doesn't make any sense, or that is not healthy, or that is not good for you. And what kind of problem is that? Or, as I put it in the handout, what kind of injustice would it be involved there? Okay, so I'll stop here so that we have time for discussion. Thank you. Questions, comments, reactions, loving gestures? Yeah, Amy?
So I'm wondering about the difference between the suspicion and doubt that leads to madness and friction or a critical disposition toward the world. Because is there a way in which being suspicious might also be healthy and indicative of the fact that we're in a relationship that's self-affirming? And then second, what about situations where your community is affirming a relationship that you're in, but you ought to fall out of love? So if you can talk a little bit about the importance of knowing how to fall out of love, and the importance of having a critical disposition to be able to do that, that would be helpful too.
Yes, that would be very helpful indeed. I want to know about all of that. Yeah. No, that's a great question. It's a very complex question. So I hope I'm not alone here in the attempt to answer that question, and you guys will help me out. Let me focus on a couple of things that I think are interesting about your question. Exactly. So when do we know that we are encountering good, productive friction that is helping us out, that is, enriching our emotional life? And when do we think that that's not the case? That the resistance that we encounter, the questioning, or whatever it is not that kind of good, productive, healthy friction anymore. Now, with respect to love, I mean, in one of the quotes that I included in the handout, he says love is the kind of thing that has to be put to the test, right? Now, obviously, he's saying if love and your gestures of love don't encounter any friction and are not put to the test, are not called into question, we don't know yet how real that love really is. We don't know how far it goes. We don't know much yet about your commitments. But at the same time, going back to what you were saying, if we are constantly putting our love to the test, that's unlivable. That is the kind of questioning, obsessive questioning, that is not just one kind of friction that we can incorporate in our life. It seems to be the path to destruction, the path to madness. It seems to be impossible to live in constant suspicion. Now notice that what do we mean when we say we put love to the test? And who can call that into question? And there is the internal friction that comes from the people involved, right? You yourself can put your love to the test. The person you claim to love or you make a loving gestures to could put that to the test. And if things don't mean the same thing, if you're like, I passed the test, I just showed you how much you love me. Or how much I love you. And the other person says, no, you didn't pass the test. That doesn't show me how much you love me. That is one kind of friction, internal friction within the relationship, right? That can also be of either kind. Healthy, productive friction you can live with, or obsessive, compulsive, destructive, unlivable. But that is different from the kind of friction that you're going to find with the outside world. Right, with the surrounding people. The network of friends, like in the movie Othello or the play Othello, right? The friends, the co-workers, or just society in general, and how people are reacting to your expressions of love and your loving actions and gestures. So there are different kinds of friction. They come from different places. What they amount to, whether it is friction that you want to preserve, to find out more about your love, or whether you want to stop it and say, no, that becomes unlivable. Right. I haven't answered that question yet. Well, this is one thing. For Wittgenstein, there is no universal answer. Depending on the type of love that you are trying to develop, depending on the affective structure in particular that we are talking about, and the practices that go along with that, you will find certain standards, certain normative expectations. And if the doubting, the questioning, the friction makes it impossible to live up to those expectations, then there is something wrong with that. But at the same time, right, that is something that you can find in Wittgenstein, that kind of social phenomenology, that kind of social answer. But be careful, because he's saying you have to take into account the normative standards that have been developed in that practice, in that form of life. But you have to be careful, because I don't think he's saying, and that's all there is. And you have to be in conformity with that, or simply accepting that. Because those standards, those expectations are always contested. They are always, part of the ongoing normative negotiations of the people involved. So there may be things that are excluded, there may be things that are not taken into account, there may be expectations that are unfair for some people in their relationship and have to be revised, or whatever the case may be. Does anybody else want to help with this question or with other things that are on the table? Yeah, Jeffrey?
A complaint often about some forms of skepticism is that it's generated only by a kind of high redefinition of the phenomenon that you're concerned with. Starting with the familiar cases of Descartes, if this is what you mean by knowledge, you can't have it.
Right.
Why should we construe knowledge this way? It's like, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good kind of phenomenon.
That's right.
And I'm wondering in particular, given the distinction you made between being in a loving relation and being in love, you said that in the former case, it entails a form of reciprocity. Why couldn't something like the following line of thought be sufficiently satisfying to dispel a kind of reasonable skepticism about, say, romantic love and the things it entails, like intimacy and so on?
Right.
I'm actually latching on, just to make the question clear, to the notion of reciprocity, because there are different species of reciprocity. There are kind of indirect, transactional, like if you're, I'll give you, 2 pounds of pork belly, if you give me $10, and so on and so forth, a kind of contractual, indirect kind of reciprocity. And then there's this view that's expressed metaphorically in the Symposium by Aristophanes, in which he thinks, again, in this metaphorical way, as romantic love and the intimacy involved, as a kind of merging of two, without losing autonomy altogether, into a new expanded one.
That's right.
People even talk. We do this, we do that. The we becomes the new I, and so on and so forth. And then the kind of reciprocity that's involved in that kind of intimacy is palpably different. And if it's palpably different over the long term, when it's put to the test, and that person's good is your good. It's not, I'm happy because maybe tomorrow I'll get mine in return and so on. And you could see how they're going to develop more fully. Why wouldn't that quell any kind of reasonable skepticism about being in a loving relationship?
That's right. And there are people like Stanley Cavell who would agree with you fully and would conclude, following that reasoning, therefore Wittgenstein can be considered a skeptic. Wittgenstein can be considered a skeptic because, in a way, he's saying there is some truth to skepticism. And the shape this takes in Cavell, which is very, very easy to connect with your remarks, Jeffrey, is the following. Well, what Wittgenstein is telling us about love, and about other things as well, is that if you start with the wrong concept and a highly idealized concept of love, such as the concept that involves perfect symbiosis, perfect union, notice, then you are killing the person that you are loving. You are becoming him, or he's becoming you. And that is paradoxical and problematic in itself. That involves that you cannot live with the autonomy of the other person, or the independence of the other person, or the agency of the other person that you cannot control. And that is a huge problem, and that's why Othello was not a random choice. The Wittgensteinians used Shakespeare, because you can find this in Shakespeare, not only in Othello, but in King Lear and in other plays. They have all these resources, right, from Shakespeare, to see how there is this, Western, modern conception of love that has violence in it, and it has impossibility in it. And why? Because the autonomous agency of the other is something that you want, but at the same time is something that you cannot tolerate. And that's why Othello cannot tolerate the very idea that Desdemona has her own sexual agency and her own independence. And that is an skeptical conclusion to say, if you start with that definition of love, then love is impossible. Right. Now, at the same time, though, I think there is a problem with that, with saying, therefore, he's a skeptic, and all he's trying to say is that love is, with respect to love, for example, that love is impossible. Well, that's not the only thing he's saying. He's criticizing idealizations about love and problematic expectations, but he's also gesturing towards our actual practice in which people do love each other without going crazy and without destroying themselves. And there are ways of making this livable. And there are ways of throwing away those expectations and realizing that there is something wrong with them and that we're going to be affected by these problems and these concerns. But there is a way of developing a relationship, a loving relationship, that doesn't necessarily require that. But by the way, just one more thing about what you said. What you said is crucial for him, I think, that there are different kinds of loves, different kinds of reciprocity, and to misunderstand the kind of reciprocity that should be expected could be part of the problem. It's not the same thing to have a loving relation with a friend or with a partner and so on. So, yeah. Yes, Marilyn.
So it's very easy to think that the mediation of the internet cheapens human relationships. There's no direct corporal interchange. It's at a distance. You Skype your lover instead of actually encountering them. You friend 1,000 people on Facebook and you like them all and so on.
Right.
So the easy thing is to say this is somehow cheapening or ruining close, intimate, interpersonal relationships. I wonder if, with Wittgenstein in mind, we could think of some ways in which maybe it's improving close, intimate relationships.
Well, I don't know about the last part, especially because I was getting so excited about everything you said before that. And how Wittgensteinian. Let me just say something quick.
I'm trying to be skeptical. No, maybe that's not the whole story.
Well, in Wittgensteinian terms, he would say, about the first part of what you said, absolutely, that shows that love, expressions of loves, are taking a different shape with new generations and new technology and new mediations. Now there are new gestures of love, and now there are new patterns that are supposed to go with those gestures. But notice the changes. Notice the changes in the physiognomy of love. And now that is an opportunity for a critical reflection and a cultural reflection. What is that doing to our affective lives? Are they becoming impoverished because of that? Or not? Going back to your last question. Or are there new opportunities to develop loving relationships that we didn't have before, or to cultivate them, to maintain them in ways in which it was impossible before? Because when there were certain obstacles, such as distance, impossibility to communicate, to get together, now we have technology that enables you to overcome those obstacles and to maintain the relationship under certain conditions. That could be, and you could have both. You could have certain ways in which love and loving relationships are becoming impoverished, and you can pay attention to that. And you can also have new opportunities and new ways of expanding what love means and how to maintain a loving relationship. Yeah. Andrew?
Yeah, so I guess I'm just puzzled about how the conclusion doesn't just automatically follow once you accept that there's no necessary and sufficient conditions that you can give for love. Because all of your examples for the skepticism were meaning skepticism, but if I can't give necessary and sufficient conditions for love, of course I'm going to give skepticism. Right? I can always ask the further question. Was that really a case of X? Because I don't have the conditions to know I'm satisfying what when X actually obtained. So I'm just
right, but notice, well, there are two things here. Who has the burden to show that there are or that there aren't necessary and sufficient conditions? Wittgenstein thinks that the burden is in the person who claims that there are necessary and sufficient conditions, because that person claims there can be a definition. I can give you a definition that covers all the cases. And he's saying, well, give me one, and I'll give you the counterexample. And I'll give you phenomena that we call love that don't fit there. He doesn't think that the skeptic, if you want to call him a skeptic for that reason, he's a skeptic at least in this sense. Love doesn't have a definition. Love doesn't have an essence. He's the skeptic. He doesn't have the burden to show that there are no necessary and sufficient.
He does have the burden if he wants to say that it's impossible to give necessary and sufficient conditions, right?
He doesn't have a transcendental argument that can show a priori that it is impossible to have necessary and sufficient conditions. That's true. And if I gave that impression, then I overstated the case, and that doesn't really capture what he means.
It turned out, though, that interestingly, that I could learn the
Right.
necessary and sufficient conditions and figure out that I was in love the whole time.
Well, that's right, and he's paying attention to that. He's saying, look, you may think you're in love in one practice, and if you're confused about what love is, and what counts as love in that practice, you may not be in love, or the other way around. You may not think you're in love, but then, depending on what counts as love, you may be, right? But he doesn't think that's a problem for him. And the fact that you don't have a universal definition of love, the fact that you don't have necessary and sufficient conditions that will cover all the cases of what counts as being in love, doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot make sense of what people try to express when they make a loving gesture, right? You can say, well, in this case, in this localized, contextualized phenomenon, these are the standards. They are not necessary and sufficient conditions for all cases, but in this case, you have to have at least these expectations met. Yeah.
Similar, I want to push a little further. Given how you began by talking about Wittgenstein recasting what we philosophers are about, not about philosophy, but about philosophizing, about praxis.
Right.
Let's take the case what you were saying in response to Jeffrey about there may be a number of different modes of reciprocity, for example. And you, what said to Jeffrey, one would have to understand, come to understand what form of love it is, what the particular mode of reciprocity would be for this particular phase of the relationship or whatever. What does it mean here to say, come to understand? What constitutes understanding? I mean, I think this would be somewhat similar to Andrew's question. Okay, if I don't do it in terms of norms having to do with necessary and sufficient condition, blah, 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 okay, if those are out, what now become, if you will, the criteria, the norms for something called understanding?
Right. And that is a huge question, and as you know, a question that Wittgenstein was very much concerned with. And in the philosophical investigations, there are all these reflections about understanding and what it means to understand something. They are not about understanding affective bonds and complex affective structures. They are about understanding mathematics or counting or writing or things like that. But a lot of what he says there applies here as well. Understanding is an achievement. It is an achievement notion for him. Now, it is an achievement that is not decided by a single instant or a single act or a single episode. It is something that has to be proven again and again. When we teach somebody something new, a new practice, there could be aha moments that the learner has or those around him or her that suggest, aha, he got it. Now he gets it, or now I get it. Now, that itself doesn't guarantee the accomplishment. That doesn't guarantee, because you can be confused about that. You can be wrong about that. You may think, oh, now I understand what love is. Well, do you really? And I think that in a way, this goes back to Amy's question about good friction and bad friction and madness and all of that. I think in a way he is saying we shouldn't ever make that question disappear. We shouldn't ever settle what it means to understand something, in this case love, for example, and not ask that question again. Because then you close possibilities for learning, for growing, for detecting things that you have not detected before. So in a way, that question has to be kept alive. You should keep asking yourself, and we should keep asking each other, what does it mean? What do you mean? Do we really understand what love is? But at the same time, so he is with you guys on that, and in that minimal sense, I think he would be happy to say that he's a skeptic. We have to remain skeptical about understanding, for example. But at the same time, though...
I'm calling him a skeptic. I might be tempted to call him a pragmatist, but
right.
a skeptic.
Right, and the pragmatism has that critical dimension, but it has also this other dimension that goes back to what Amy was concerned about, which is, okay, we want friction, we want critical interrogation, we want this kind of openness, but we don't want to go crazy. We don't want to be derailed so that we cannot even have an emotional life to begin with, so that we cannot even love anybody, so that we have this destructive path. And how do we distinguish between those two things, which was part of your original question? How do we know when we're encountering friction that helps us, that can be incorporated in our lives, and when that has to be stopped, when that doesn't have a place in our lives.
Philosophizing will not take the risk out of loving.
Right. Yes.
Thank you very much for an interesting talk. You mentioned early on about how there's different kinds of love or different aspects of love. And then most of the discussion seemed to be love of the kind of an intimate association, romantic love or familial love, friendship love.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder what the discussion would be, or the analysis would be with respect to what in the Christian context is sometimes called agape, or in Buddhism is referred to as bodhicitta, this kind of universal love that includes not only close associates, but even people we don't know so well, maybe even people we don't know at all, maybe even enemies, and yet nonetheless a person with a certain cultivation would feel a love for those others. And in that case, we don't have the reciprocal associations that you're talking about here, and yet nonetheless we might, in a real and even in a profound sense, still call that love. I'm curious what you, on behalf of Wittgenstein, might say.
Right. That is a good question, and he does have some remarks that connect with that when he talks about love of life, love of humanity, and so on. I mean, there are abstract forms of love in which you don't see anybody face to face. You love humanity, but it's...
Way. I mean, this could be a very heartfelt, very profound, and emotional kind of love in its own way, not mere cognitive love or mere abstract love.
Right. I think you still, however, try to bring what that means, to make a loving gestures towards humanity, or to make a loving gestures with respect to life itself, or something like that, to what does that mean for our day-to-day practices and for our interactions and for our form of life. And you're right, it is a different kind of thing because it's not something that involves commitments and attitudes and expressions that you have to show, that you have to prove in particular actions facing particular others. But at the same time, if it is part of your affective structure and how that connects with your agency, with the things that you do, there should then be also something that can be called putting that to the test, and whether or not it is an empty gesture that you're making when you say that you love humanity, or it is a gesture that really means something. And then we want to know what is the pattern of actions and expressions that go along with that gesture. Gary?
So since you invited the connection to Kierkegaard, I thought I'd ask whether Wittgenstein thinks that when faced with a really serious skepticism of love, whether or not it's advisable to make a leap of faith and to pretend or simply decide that one is in love. Or is he more like Camus, perhaps, who thinks that this would be a destruction of one's rational capacities and that it's better to be a Don Juan and to begin the romantic process again and again and again, because there's never any certainty at the end that you actually have achieved your goal. So it's the type of friction that Wittgenstein is calling for in terms of romantic interaction or intimate interaction, something that requires always beginning again in some way?
I think the answer is yes and no. In a certain way, you can describe a lot of the moves that he makes in the way you did, or in the way you were suggesting, as a leap of faith. So when he says, for example, and that was one of the quotes that I didn't read, somewhere we have to start with not doubting. Somewhere we have to start trusting. You can say, well, what he's saying about this basic kind of trust, that it is immediate, it has to do with our embodied affective reactions, and it is there. Maybe it is a leap of faith, that you just have to do it, because if you don't, you cannot have friends, you cannot have lovers, you cannot have any kind of affective bond that means anything. And that is a leap of faith. So in that kind of sense, yes. But in another kind of sense, I would say no, because he's saying, and we do that together. We take that leap of faith, if you want to call it that, together. We start trusting and not doubting in relation to other people. And what that means is you have to take into account the other, and you have to take into account the community. And it is not admissible to say, well, he or she or whoever just told me no, that he doesn't or she doesn't want to get into this loving relationship, but I'm going to continue. I'm going to reinterpret that. I'm not going to take into account. I'm going to make this leap of faith that tomorrow he will love me. Well, you become a stalker, right? And you become a danger to yourself and to other people. And it's not the same thing to take a leap of faith of that kind in which you are simply going to reinterpret, question, what you have in front of you. That's different from saying, well, I have this way of handling life that takes into account those around me, and I'm not taking this leap of faith by myself. Others are doing it with me. Yes, Larry. Oops.
So,
Yeah.
so Wittgenstein says that you couldn't ever write a book about ethics, or that if you did, it would explode all other books in the lecture.
Right.
And so I wonder what Wittgenstein would say about giving a lecture about love. Can you give a lecture about love of the sort that you've been trying to do from a Wittgensteinian perspective?
That is a really interesting question. I think he would say, no, you cannot and shouldn't give a lecture about love. However, I think he would say, like any other kind of philosophical reflection, it is a conversation. It is something that you can do with other people. It is something, he was not a professor who would lecture to his students, but he had this very interactive kind of lecture that was a conversation. And the conversation could be critical, negative, undermining or undoing, assumptions and presuppositions. And, you can give an interactive lecture on love of that kind. And it doesn't have to be only purely critical, negative. It can also point at actual practices and actual relationships and what they mean for people so that you are making the philosophical discourse on love answerable to actual practices and actual experiences that people have. So yeah, maybe there's something Wittgensteinian about giving a lecture on love, but there is nothing Wittgensteinian about what we're doing now, having this conversation about love.
Is there a significant difference between what he would say about ethics and what he would say about love as a topic? Or would the lecture on love as with the lecture on ethics explode all over the lecture?
Right. Well, I think there is probably a difference because he has an expressivist leaning with respect to normativity and ethics and so on that makes him a quietist of sorts. There is more to say, however, about emotions and emotional reactions and affective responses, right? He's an expressivist there too. It is all about how you express that. But you can describe, you can do sociological reflections of our affective lives and try to ask pointed questions, critical questions that would make people engage in this kind of philosophical therapeutic activity. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I want to ask a little bit about the third set of questions that you have in the handout, and in particular about the very last one about injustices.
Yeah.
Because I think what sounds so great about some of this therapeutic approach is the unsettling, the kind of pluralism that seems to come out of this type of critical engagement. But I'm wondering about cases of, say, marginalized and oppressed folks whose condition of oppression is such that they doubt or have no grounding from which to justify what their perception of an injustice is.
That's right.
And so I'm wondering what are the Wittgensteinian tools for grounding one's, say, positionhood in order to fight against injustices or to be able to take a kind of stability that would be able to push back against what they experience as oppression.
Well, as you know, he wasn't a social and political thinker, so he himself didn't have a whole lot to say about this. But I think there are resources within Wittgensteinian philosophy to address those issues. For one thing, he keeps talking about how a language game, a linguistic practice, a discursive practice is differently inhabited by different people. And not everybody has the same agency in it. And he doesn't talk about it in terms of power, but he does make very clear that not everybody is entitled to make the same moves. And the moves that are being made don't mean the same thing for everybody. So I think you're absolutely right, which was another reason why I chose Othello, which I didn't show, but I told you about the clip. Because in Othello, you can see very clearly, at least in this adaptation, of course it doesn't mean the same thing to experience friction, to experience a very deep critical interrogation when you are a black man in a relationship with a white woman that nobody accepts. So it matters deeply where you are in the practice, the kind of agency that you have, the kind of entitlements that you have or don't have, and yes, and that has to be taken into account. And that should be not an afterthought or something to be added. That should be, in my view, this is not Wittgenstein, this is me, that should be the starting point. It is a social and political question from the beginning, precisely because we don't have the same vulnerabilities, and precisely because we don't have the same forms of empowerment and agential capacities. We have to be very careful how we handle this questioning of our affective life. Maybe you are questioning your own affective reactions because you have been stigmatized or marginalized or led to believe that you cannot love in that way. And maybe you are doing a harm to yourself using this friction again and again. Or maybe you are harming others because you are calling into question their affective relations. And you are not taking into account that maybe they don't make sense to you fully because you are applying the wrong standards, or because you are not taking into account that people can love in that way, or whatever it is. Yeah.
Just to kind of maybe continue the question a little bit more. Well, I think it might be the case that there's more often a tendency to be questioning one's own position if one is constantly called into question by others.
Right.
And so I think it's actually
That's
might
right.
be a symptom of privilege, or a kind of position of privilege that allows one not to critique their own positionality. So I'm wondering about that relationship between one who's constantly in a position of critiquing and wondering and doing this kind of social location, understanding their own social location, and those who are not, precisely because of social practices, are not often put in the position of having to consider their social location.
That's absolutely right. And I'm glad you made that remark because it connects with a lot of things that I had in the background and I left in the background because I didn't have time. Although there was one quote that did, in the middle section that I skipped also, that connected to that. In uncertainty, there are all these remarks about how trusting oneself is intimately related with trusting others and how you yourself have been trusted by others. And that connects with one aspect of what you're saying. Precisely the people who have not been trusted, for example, are more likely to distrust themselves and not to develop sufficient self-trust to have a healthy life. And that is a problem, and that is something to take into account from the beginning. We shouldn't invite everybody equally to be skeptical about themselves and to distrust themselves, because in some cases we may be contributing to the madness or the impossible healthy cognitive and affective life of that person. And once again, Othello can be an example of that. Why is he so vulnerable to Iago? Why does he extremely quickly succumb to these doubts? Well, because he had never been trusted, and he had been taught not to trust himself. And he has a special vulnerability that other people don't have. And it has to do, of course, with injustices and forms of exclusion and marginalization. And that's a crucial aspect of all of this. Yeah, very good.
We could, if we unpack philosophy, we can understand philosophy as the love of wisdom. And I'm wondering, especially given that Wittgenstein had an ambivalent relation to philosophy itself, whether there anything we can learn from what you said about Wittgenstein's treatment of love, about his way of understanding philosophy, if philosophy were itself a form of love, or if it's really just a semantic parallel that I'm drawing. Because clearly philosophy is undertaken in conversation. It often involves reciprocity. It often involves misunderstanding about what even philosophy is. So I'm wondering whether there is a sort of a reflexive dimension to...
That's a really interesting question. I've never thought about love in that sense, but you're right. Wittgenstein has a very tormented relationship with philosophy. If we think about philosophy as a kind of passion or love of wisdom, or he seems to be saying most of the time that it is a very destructive, unhealthy, maddening passion and a bad love. But at the same time, as you know, I mean, he has also these moments in which he's saying, but there is a philosophical activity, a therapeutic, philosophy as a therapy, that may not drive you crazy and may actually do something for you, may enrich your life or may enrich your capacities in some way. And that would be a way of taking a different kind of love of wisdom, a different kind of philosophical passion in a different direction. And it has at least some features, namely it is interactive, it's something that you do with other people, in conversation with other people. It's a way of, going back to the rough ground, going back to your everyday practices so that you don't lose what you had, but now you can look at what you had in a different way. Yeah.
I was wondering if, like, small toddlers can love their parents, or if a pet can love its owner, if love is a human phenomenon, what's the criteria of being able to understand what love is? If I, as a parent, recognize these gestures of things that would mimic love from a child, even though the child may not recognize it as love,
Right.
what's that kind of relationship look like?
I know. What does it look like? I don't know. That's a great question. So let me say at least the following. He clearly could say, because he says this about children all the time, and novices in a practice, people who are developing, their capacities to participate in that practice. He could say, well, we extend to them by courtesy all these things that they may or may not fully have yet. So, for example, when he says, the child is learning to count or to write down something, and we extend by courtesy the full capacity that he doesn't yet have, and we say he seems to understand, or he does understand, but of course we know that the understanding is never fully demonstrated, and is certainly not there yet. We have to wait until those capacities are there. Now, there are all kinds of problems with that. One problem is that, of course, it would be devastating for a lot of people to think, my children don't love me, my pets don't love me, and then obviously, not only you have to wait until the development is there so that you can see the full pattern and the sustained capacity of doing that kind of thing, in this case, love. It is also the case that in some cases, the possibility may not be there, especially if we talk, for example, about love across species, my pet, or whatever. Or if we talk about people who don't develop certain capacities, human beings who, have certain disabilities and they are not able to develop their affective and cognitive lives fully. Does that mean that I can never, because of those constraints and because the trajectory didn't go all the way, that I can never have reciprocity with them? I can never say that they love me? So there is a real problem there, and I don't think Wittgenstein has all the answers. But yeah, that's a great question.
I also think it's a great question, and brings up for me, what about the relationship between children? Is it possible for an adult? It's always necessary for an adult figure to be there to confer, out of respect, the full capacity for love on the child's between children.
Right.
It seems problematic to me if we can't think about children amongst themselves. Children have loving relationships.
That's right.
Between one another. Maybe it goes to, this problem of children as being somehow little adults, or adults and potential adults, instead of something. I think Merleau-Ponty talks about, the child's world as a world, in itself, and not necessarily to be measured by the adult world, or from the perspective
Right.
of the adult world.
That's right. And there is the more general kind of question, which is that when do you know? In this case, for example, love among children, or love among a particular group that functions differently. When do you know that you have encountered a different kind of love that has to be understood differently, or you have something that is not love, right? How do you know whether or not you should apply the standards from another practice, or you have a new practice there that has its own standards, and you're just not recognizing the gestures of love appropriately, and you are expecting things that, of course, they're not capable of. They're not going to give to each other. Yeah. Yes, John?
Say, Wittgenstein and you are in league in not looking for nature or the essence, as you put it.
Right.
But throughout your lovely talk, again and again, you came up with phrases like, this isn't really love. Love involves relationship to another and to myself maybe and to a community. How are those not searches for ultimate nature?
Well, they are not universal claims, and they are not claims about all kinds of loves for the following reason. So what he's saying, and this is in one of the quotes that you saw, if you are talking about romantic love, and you are going by these expressive practices that we have to show these complex affective structures to each other, you cannot simply claim that you have loved for a second, for example, that you have this instantaneous love. I love you now, oh, but it's gone, I don't love you anymore. Well, that's not what we mean by love. That is not an essentialist claim, because it's not about the essence of love. It is about what we call love in this practice, what it means to each other, what kind of commitment you are undertaking when you express that love to me. And you are entitled to claim that there is a kind of love that is instantaneous, and it comes and goes, and it doesn't involve any commitment on your part. And you're entitled to that, but that would be a different language game. That would be the attempt to create a new practice of expressing love. And you have to take responsibility for what you're doing. You are irresponsible if you give the impression that you're playing the same game, that with your gesture of love, you are not committing yourself to all these things that people are expecting. You are irresponsible if you do that, if you play along but you mean something else. But I don't see how that requires any kind of commitment to the essence of love or to necessary and sufficient conditions that are there for all expressions of love at all times. Does that help?
For all the world, you're saying this is not love. Now,
Well, in the context,
not love in this context, is that what you mean?
well, he's saying in the practice, one of the things that he seems to be saying in these remarks, in the practice in which we draw a distinction between love and infatuation, right? Infatuation is a mood, according to him, or an emotional episode that you can have, and it can be confined to a period of time and so on. Love is something different. And that's why we say things, oh, that was not love, that was infatuation. Because I thought I had this structure that connected my feelings and my emotions, but then in the end, that structure was not there, right? So it's a way of organizing your emotional life. And that organization may or may not be there. But now that organization is part of a practice and a way of thinking about ourselves and a way of communicating with each other. And it is something that is open to change. That's also why he's not an essentialist, and this is not a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. It is always conceivable that it will be different in the future, that there will be other conditions that have to be met, or that some of the conditions that we use today will disappear. That is possible. Oh, yes, sorry.
Can I just follow up? Sorry to do this to you again, John, but I'm going to defend you. One of the things that we discover when we go back to the rough ground is that there are counterexamples for any proposed analysis offering necessary and sufficient conditions. But another thing we find in the rough ground is that there's an incredible amount of agreement across time and culture about obviously defective cases, right? And I think the Othello case is an example of we're interested in Cole Porter and Dolly Parton songs. We're interested in certain works of literature,
right,
precisely because it is inconceivable to us that what is described in these works is anything other than a distortion of love or healthy relations or healthy loving relations. So it looks to me like for every counterexample to the necessary and sufficient conditions that are proposed, I can also point to, right, cases in which if there are no necessary and sufficient conditions, does the Wittgensteinian explain, right, over centuries,
right? If you look at literature, widespread agreement that that's an example of a distortion of love. It seems as if that's evidence for thinking that there are necessary and sufficient conditions. That's a counterexample to the counterexamples.
Well, but there are two things here. One is that Wittgenstein doesn't rule out the possibility that we may find things in human forms of life that have been there at all times. But there is, and in fact, he uses the very expression, Lebensform, a form of life, in two ways, as something historical, specific, variable, historically situated, and in some cases, in the singular, the Lebensform, a form of life in the singular, he's talking about the human form of life. The form of life that seems to have been there at all times. Notice, however, that even when he makes those claims, he is not an essentialist. He remains a naturalist. And he keeps saying that doesn't mean that it cannot change. That doesn't mean that we couldn't, in principle, find other possible forms of life, or that in the future, human beings can mutate. So even when you find something universal, in the sense that it has been there at all times in all places, that's not the same thing as to say I have found an essence. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind, you are right. Every time you find something that is a counterexample, or you are making a normative judgment, and you have to tell me why that is a defective case, a pathological case, a deviant case, or why not just another way of loving or another practice that. And the answer to that is yes, you're absolutely right. And that means the philosopher, and Wittgenstein himself, although he didn't think he was political, or he was, the philosopher himself, in using the counterexamples, in parceling out practices in a particular way, in giving the physiognomy, in giving the description, is also doing something normative. Is also taking a stand. Is also saying, yes, there are these ongoing negotiations, and there are all these different practices. And I also, in saying that this is a deviant case, I'm also saying I'm a member of this practice. And I'm not a member of the community that wants to turn this kind of love into something healthy and functional and just an alternative community of people loving each other. But I don't see how that is an objection or a refutation of the view. It shows that the view...
it's not a refutation. It's just a counter move against the... If you said, in response to the earlier question, any attempt that someone proposes necessary and sufficient conditions,
there would be a counter
Wittgensteinian gives a counterexample. Therefore, we beg off. Right, we don't deny that there could be necessary and sufficient conditions. We just claim we've got no reason yet, and the burden is on you, necessary and sufficient conditions person,
right, to
give
show
them to
me
that is going to be invulnerable to counterexample. But it seems to me that the necessary and sufficient conditions fan can just say, well, no, the burden's on you to explain why there is what looks to me like an incredible amount of agreement in the rough ground about the defective cases being defective cases. That's something that your account has to explain to me now. So it looks to me like there's an analogous move on the part of the proponent of the necessary and sufficient conditions analysis that you're not accounting for.
But it's not analogous. No, but it's not analogous in the following sense. The anti-essentialist counterexamples work only if the proponent of necessary and sufficient conditions acknowledges that that is to be covered by the list of necessary and sufficient conditions, but he has no way to explain how it can be covered. In other words, if certain things are said about love in general, and they work for some kinds of love but not for others, it works for romantic love, maybe it works for filial love, but it doesn't work for love among friends, or whatever, or other kinds of love, if he accepts that is also a kind of love, that is also a phenomenon that we call love, then it is a counterexample, right, that doesn't commit me to anything. I'm just appealing to the answerability to actual practices and actual ways of speaking, and how what you are doing, the philosopher, doesn't harmonize with that, doesn't survive the friction. And why is that a problem? He thinks that can go in two ways. Either you start becoming the kind of philosopher who develops a theory that doesn't fit actual life, and therefore what you're saying is irrelevant, it's not going to be implemented, it's not going to be applied to our practices of love, or then you're going to, in order to accommodate the counterexample or whatever, you're going to push your necessary and sufficient condition in such a weird way that then you're going to be creating all kinds of distortions and problems for our practices. That is different from saying, well, he himself also, Wittgenstein, or whoever is using the counterexamples, is taking a normative stance or committing himself to some things. That's a different problem, I think, right? No? Yes, Darla?
Hi, yes, this is great. So I wonder why we're talking about madness in this way, and the question particularly, can we escape madness, comes back into me again and again. We're thinking of ways, and it seems like we need the right answer to the question of how we can escape madness.
Yeah.
But I wonder if a better question is, what are the ways in which an acceptance of the inability to escape madness could be a way to get back to the rough ground, is the way that we get back to the rough ground, is a way to do the practice.
Right.
So I'm just concerned.
No, that's an excellent question. What do we mean exactly by madness? Right. And what are the therapeutic activities, the therapeutic practices that can help us either to block that madness or to get out of it if we're already experiencing that madness? Yeah. I mean, I think the kind of madness he's talking about is the kind of philosophical reflection, philosophical obsession that will constrain your life, that it will create problems for, in this case, your affective lives, the kinds of bonds that you can have with other people, the kinds of things that you can do in your life. Now, what are the activities, especially within philosophy, that can help you to face those philosophical obsessions, to go through those philosophical reflections and without falling into the madness or getting out of it? He thinks that all the philosopher can do is to describe, right? He keeps saying it's all a matter of describing things in a particular way. At the same time, notice that he has a very thick and interesting notion of description. It's not just sociology, for example. It is also imagining scenarios. It is also using the imagination. So on the one hand, he seems to be saying we have to pay attention to actual people and actual life and describe things as they are. And that seems like, well, it sounds like he's saying the empirical sciences and sociology and anthropology and so on will keep us grounded and will show to us what we really mean when we say certain things. But then he also says you have to imagine possibilities. And you have to, and that suggests, well, you have to look at art, and you have to look at literature, and you have to look at all this. And as you were saying, and we have these cultural resources, Shakespeare, whoever, these movies also, I mean, that are supposed to be exemplars, that are supposed to be paradigms of something. Is that part of the therapy? Yeah, and I think he's saying, yes, that is part of the therapy, but it's all about how you do it. So it's not about watching films, reading ethnomethodology or anthropological studies. It's how you do it, the kind of critical activity that you are able to develop with that or through that.
So maybe just rephrase just really quickly once more. So instead of an escape from or thinking of the doing of therapy is that which is going to help alleviate the pressures of being pulled into the madness, I'm thinking more in terms of accepting a kind of madness that's inescapable and that being its own way to do the therapy, right? So maybe at the end, I will agree with the end of what you said there.
Right.
So taking practices that aren't in an effort to escape madness, but by way of recognizing that it's all around and inescapable, bringing its own kind of peace.
Well, that is an interesting way of putting it. Right, and there are passages in Wittgenstein that come close to that. It's not an escape in the sense that there will be no madness, because madness is there. It's a way of living with madness and even acknowledging that madness is there and now make that livable and create a form of life and a set of practices that acknowledge that and give us space for that. Yeah. Eric? Okay. Eric, the last question. Who? Oh, go. Who? Who are you? I don't know who. Oh, Sandy was first. I don't know who was first.
Actually, a question.
Sure, ask her.
Would it still be madness if it's just like what you're saying we should accept and embrace and if everybody does
No,
this?
I'm concerned about the norms talk, as if there's a place called madness and then there's a place where I can escape that madness, especially when I'm going to be constantly referred to or disciplined by norms that are going to tell me that I'm mad no matter what. Then is it possible to, if it's impossible to escape that madness,
Right, and there is, right. And I think part of what you were saying also, at least that's the way I reacted to it, is that there is a danger in the discourse of therapy and curing ourselves. And part of the danger is to think that we have gotten rid of something, and maybe we haven't, it's still with us, and we have to come to terms with that. And then also, there could be cases in which the madness is a systemic issue. Our form of life is mad. Our practice, our community is dysfunctional, is crazy. So it's not a, I'm sorry? Right.
Unjust
Instead of mad.
I don't know, can there be a right kind of, can there be a right kind of living or right kind of life in an unjust society?
That's right, I agree. And I wish Wittgenstein used the language of justice and injustice, but he doesn't. I think that it's not either or. I agree, and that is also my own philosophical instinct, that it would be even more helpful to talk about unjust forms of life and so on. But you also have the very strong affective language of madness and dysfunctionality that shows that it has to do with social organizations and social arrangements and social relations, but it also has to do with how people feel and how they react to each other affectively. Yeah. We're never going to get out of this.
For reality.
Yeah. We'll talk more.
Yes. You talk about love of a machine. In other words, not just love of object, but the movie She, for instance.
Oh, yeah. Her, the movie Her.
Whatever, yeah.
That's right. But that's intercorporeality, too.
Yeah, but